Well, we have almost got to the finish line, the long 2024 election process as the United States of America and Wisconsin elect the next president. And somebody that knows a bit about the candidates and the job at hand is the Honorable Pete Buttigieg. And first of all, thank you for spending just a few minutes with us to talk about this election.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
You know the vice president exceptionally well. You ran for the nomination against her about 5 years ago, and you've seen her in action during the last 4 years in the administration as well. Is there anything in particular that has jumped out in terms of qualities or any aspect that has jumped out to you in terms of her ability to do the job as president of the United States?
Yeah, a few things. First of all, she really sees people. I think that's part of why we became friends, even while we were running against each other, which is not something that happens every day. But she's somebody who I think appreciates just the common humanity of people who come together from different walks of life. She's also very smart and very focused. I think that's part of what made her a good prosecutor. She has a way, especially when you're talking through an issue, of asking the questions that cut down to the absolute core of the issue. And I think she's been using that to try to get to the focus of things like, okay, how do we make it more affordable in this country, especially with all the post-COVID price inflation that we're only now really fully coming out of. How do we make sure that it's easier to get by? It's why she's been so focused on things like the child tax credit and making it more affordable to raise kids, trying to move in a very different direction from the Trump focus of tax cuts on the rich. She's going to, I think, show those same qualities as president that helped her as a candidate, as a prosecutor, and as VP.
You're somebody that has worked and lived in the Midwest. We've seen the candidates here in the Midwest for so often during this campaign cycle. We've seen the way that the candidates talk about the future, talk about where the country is, talk about our cities. When the former president goes to Milwaukee before the convention, goes to Detroit, has a different way of putting things than the vice president has. As somebody from the Midwest, what have you noticed about this campaign in terms of the way that the candidates have spoken to the people here?
Well, look, I think there's something about Donald Trump that's almost extravagantly un-Midwestern, not to say anti-Midwestern. I grew up surrounded by values around decency and humility and truth-telling, and that's just not how he comes at it. She's got, I think, a real focus on making sure that we have leaders who respect you even when they disagree. It's why she's taken the step of pledging that she's going to include Republicans in her administration, even while he's out there saying that Democrats or even Republicans who disagree with him are the enemy and ought to be thrown in jail. It's a real difference in just kind of the way you come at the world. Also, I think the Midwest has felt the ups and downs of the results of policy more than anybody. And when I think about the factories that are coming back to the Midwest right now, after years of them telling us that we were just not going to make things in this country anymore, when I think about the improvements that we're seeing to infrastructure around the Midwest, I think that's an example of what you get for having the right kind of focus and the right kind of leadership. But it's a clear contrast, and one that I think is really important to remember as we go into an election where maybe you're sitting at home, you're thinking neither one of these candidates is 100% aligned with me, and that's how it's going to be. Unless you run for president, you're never going to have a presidential candidate who agrees with you 100% of the time. But at the end of the day, I think most people, including independents and quite a few Republicans, are saying, I'm going to vote for her this time. It's going to give us a chance at a more decent future.
I'm glad you brought up factory jobs and also infrastructure, because I do think in this part of the world and part of the country, there's actually records. And that's one of the unusual aspects about this election is you have somebody, and the former president, who had a record talking about, say, infrastructure over and over again. And then you also have a record where the vice president, as part of the administration, has, I think, numbers that actually indicate what the policies that have been put forth, especially with infrastructure, where I think the way it's been rolled out has helped keep this country out of a recession. Can you compare maybe just on that one issue, what we saw in the previous 4 years and maybe what we've seen here, and how that would lead you to think of how each of these candidates would look at the future?
Yeah, well, Donald Trump came in, said he was going to pass an infrastructure bill, and then he failed to do that. It's one of many economic promises that he broke. Matter of fact, if you look at the record, the only economic promise he really kept was the one about cutting taxes for the rich, which I think shows where his actual priorities are. If you look at jobs numbers, I mean, we've never had this much job growth, certainly not in my lifetime. the number, and not just any jobs. A lot of these are factory and construction jobs, and we're seeing that largely because of the infrastructure bill that did get passed under the Biden-Harris administration, not under the Trump administration. And I think that record is important. The public safety record is important too. The fact that crime shot up when Donald Trump was president. It's gone down since he got beat. And I think electing a prosecutor is a good way to send a message that we want public safety, and we're going to try to keep that crime going down. Look, there's more work to do. I think everybody gets that. And she's been very focused, in particular, on housing. When I was growing up, housing affordability was something you heard a lot more in the big cities and on the coasts, maybe a little less in the Midwest. But now, I mean, where we live in northern Michigan, even though it's a rural area, there's lots of land, but that doesn't mean housing is affordable right now. And that's been true really in new ways, I think, across the Midwest, certainly up north. And that's something she's been very focused on too. So yes, there are results and records to compare. There's also visions to compare, because every election is about the future. And I think we just have a better future if it's under her leadership.
And I guess finally, in looking to the future, not just the issues, but also in terms of, how do I put this? In terms of how we look at each other, in terms of how we look at democracy, in terms of where we want to be. And something I talk about a lot is coming up on July the 4th of 2026. It's the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And I would hope that would be a huge celebration. The leadership of how we move down this road is vitally important as well, isn't it?
Yeah, the way I think about it is politics doesn't have to be punching us in the face every day. That's how it's felt, especially in the last 10 years or so since Donald Trump came on the scene. Just every day having to respond or react to whatever chaos or outrage he provoked with his words or with his actions. And we don't have to be talking about him all day, every day. We don't have to be talking about any president all day, every day. We could have politics on the back burner sometimes. That would actually be nice, And then when we are debating our political issues, do it with a little more respect. It can be done, even in these times. The infrastructure bill proved that. So did the CHIPS and Science Act. I know that the Republicans are talking about getting rid of it now, but actually Republicans and Democrats work together to make that happen. And it's creating a lot of factory construction and job growth in the Midwest right now. So it is possible to operate on a bipartisan basis. It's definitely something I've seen out of Tammy Baldwin and a lot of good senators on both sides of the aisle. And we need more of that right now.
Honorable Pete Buttigieg, again, really appreciate your time talking about your experiences with the vice president and the candidates. And again, really appreciate your point of view, and thanks for coming on the program.
Same here. Thanks for having me. Take care.
What a very impressive person. And when you listen to him talk, the way that he is always on top of the issues, when, we've heard so much about how he has been one that's not been afraid to go into the lion's den that is Fox News, and to be able to make points in a way that I think folks that agree with his policies and folks that disagree with his policies can appreciate and maybe understand and have those discussions. And I really liked late in the conversation when he talked about we don't have to be hit in the face all the time. We don't need to be basically in hand-to-hand combat when it comes to discussing issues and discussing our politics. And one of the things that still is exceptionally interesting is just how young he is. The idea that Pete Buttigieg is only 42 years old. He'll be turning 43 the day before Inauguration Day in January. But he already has run for president. He ran in 2020, part of the Democratic field that included Joe Biden. It included Kamala Harris, included Bernie Sanders, and many others as well. And he has been an outstanding Secretary of Transportation. And it's going to be very interesting to see if Kamala Harris wins the election. What will Pete Buttigieg do? Will he be, again, part of the cabinet? Will he step away from the cabinet, do something else? But I think there's one thing that we do know is that we have not heard the last of him when it comes to national politics. Mm-hmm. Being such a young man, so many years to go in his political career, and so many, I think, questions that will be asked and answered, because we are at a situation where, as we talked about yesterday, was 16 years ago yesterday, where the United States of America first elected a person of color when Barack Obama in the 2008 presidential election was victorious. We could be seeing history here tonight,
Oh, I certainly hope that we do.
as we could have our first female elected president of the United States, and also a female of color as well. And Pete Buttigieg, and he has been so impressive in that openly gay, and yet he's been able to gain so much support, and it says a lot about our country that, again, everything is possible. And we here in Wisconsin obviously have the first openly gay United States Senator in Tammy Baldwin, who's on the ballot again tonight. But again, I think when you look at where we are as a country and where we're going as a country, a man like Pete Buttigieg is somebody that's going to be very much at the forefront of what we are as a people in the next, not just years, but decades.
Oh, very much so. Very much.
And he's such an intelligent man in terms of, I love his demeanor, the way that he's able to talk about these issues and have discussions. We just don't have enough folks that are willing to have the discussions. He's always willing to have the discussions. Yeah. He is completely the opposite of Donald Trump. I just,
you can have a discussion without it escalating into an argument.
Right, and that's such a vital aspect in our system. Again, our system's about battles of ideas. I may disagree with somebody on tax policy, or disagree with somebody on education policy, whatever it may be. But if we have the conversations, we can always learn a little bit. We can always, find, I think, a little bit of common ground at the very least, even if we don't agree totally, but we can at least understand maybe a little bit better, and instead of making our politics, again, hand-to-hand combat. So again, I just think he's been such a positive influence in our democracy and our government.